Hi, everyone. I'm Naima Elias, a managing director in the talent marketplace at State Street. Welcome to the sixth in our series of conversations about justice, equity, and inclusion, hosted by the Massachusetts Conference for Women, State Street, and the Boston Globe. We are delighted that more than 18,000 registrants, men and women, have joined these conversations since the summer of 2020. But of course, to truly advance justice, equity, and inclusion, we need to bring more and more people into the conversation, including those who are not confident in how to talk about these issues. It's not an overstatement to say that a lack of confidence in how to talk about many of the aspects of equity and difference, from race and gender to age, religion, and more, is why too many conversations happen among people who already agree with each other. And that will never lead to the change that we need. To drive significant change, we need better language. And to guide us through a discussion of how to achieve that, we are delighted to have Celeste Hedley with us. A self-described light-skinned Black Jew, Celeste Hedley has been forced to speak about race, including having to defend or define her own since childhood. Celeste is an award-winning journalist, the host of the Conference for Women's podcast, Women Amplified, and a best-selling author. In fact, her forthcoming book, Speaking of Race, is not only the focus of today's session, but it hits bookstores on November 2nd, and it's available today for pre-sale in the Conference for Women online bookstore with free shipping. Before we get started, I want to note that today's session is being recorded, and the replay link will be emailed to all registrants within the next day or so. Please share the link with others so they can view and benefit from today's learnings as well. Celeste will open our session with remarks and then join me to discuss how we speak about race to move justice, equity, and inclusion forward. So let's give a warm virtual welcome to Celeste Hedley. Celeste.
Thank you, and hello to everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. When I was getting ready to write these remarks, I wanted to open with a James Baldwin quote, as one does. And so the first line of the speech was going to be, the great James Baldwin once said, and then I stopped and I thought, how many speeches have started that way? How many op-eds have begun with that exact same line, the great James Baldwin once said? Because James Baldwin said things better than anybody else. Even when he was speaking extemporaneously, James Baldwin had a way of articulating very complex and emotional thoughts with such power and clarity that it's impossible or foolish, I should say, to try to rephrase them. Why would you say them any other way? And so we often end up just quoting James Baldwin. But the thing of it is that James Baldwin was quite a successful writer when he was alive. He was certainly on a number of interview shows, but frankly, we didn't actually listen to him. And if we listened, we didn't believe him. So here we are quoting this man. We see him as one of the great intellectuals and authors of all American history, and yet didn't actually take his advice or follow his recommendations at all. Or if we had, we wouldn't be where we are. And in a sense, my book is designed to make sure we don't make that mistake again. This is the book for optimists, in fact. It is for people who believe that we actually can change things. People who think, I can make a difference and I want to know how. Not in broad strokes. None of us are the president unless Joe Biden happens to be on. But in specific, really actionable ways, something that takes you 30 seconds each day or 5 minutes in a day, small ways that you can begin to move the needle. And that's what the book is about, is how do we do this, average, regular people like me, step by step. There has been a resurgence in interest in James Baldwin's work, and that's certainly because of many of the tragic events that have made headlines over the past 5 to 10 years more. All of these events, including cell phone video footage that have made it impossible for us as a nation to pretend for any longer that racism is not real, is not alive and well, and is not damaging and killing Black people, from Trayvon Martin to Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, to Sandra Brown and Breonna Taylor, to Tamir Rice, to Eric Garner, to Elijah McCain, to Ahmaud Arbery, to George Floyd. There are so many names at this point that we should be saying, that we should be remembering. And for many of us, our hearts break in anguish when we think about that. It makes me feel angry. It makes me feel confused sometimes, disappointed for certain. But at least there has been progress in that this country, for the most part, has finally accepted that racism is still with us and that it endangers the lives of our coworkers and friends and neighbors of color. But sometimes we don't know what to say. And I understand that. I know that it sometimes feels too big and too awful and unspeakable. And so we either say nothing or we return to James Baldwin and we let him say it for us. And my question today, and in the book actually, is who is today's James Baldwin? Who is the person who is speaking with clarity and wisdom right now that we are not listening to? That's what interests me, is getting us to learn how to listen. Because remember, at one point, James Baldwin said, I was born almost 60 years ago. I'm not going to live another 60 years. You always told me it takes time. It's taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's and my sister's time, my nieces and my nephew's time. How much time do you want for your progress? He died in 1987. And here we still are believing incredibly ridiculous things about each other based only on the color of our skin, still not listening to one another. We often go into these conversations only concerned about what we're going to say and don't at all give a thought to what it is that we are interested in hearing. Or most often we're avoiding the conversation because we're afraid of an argument or we're afraid of being called a racist. This book tries to let you know the conversation is not as scary as you think. You don't need to avoid it because it's not the end of the world. And it certainly tries to take the power out of that word racist. There is no question that there are varying degrees of damage from racism. There is no question that between two people who might both have prejudiced views, one is very likely worse than the other. But because we're all biased and prejudiced, we can stop being afraid of that word. If you say something racist, it is not a catastrophe. You can come back from that if what you're interested in is learning. One of the things I say in the book is there are two kinds of people in this world. There are those who have said the wrong thing about race and those who will. And we all have to end this together. And that means we have to be willing to have some uncomfortable conversations. It's just that simple. 5-minute conversations with somebody in line at the grocery store, 30-minute conversations over dinner at the holidays with your family, 10-minute conversations during your kids' soccer game. And by the way, please talk to your kids. We have to have so many of these conversations that it becomes exposure therapy. That by having so many of them, by doing it again and again and again, it stops being scary. And my book tries to walk you through that process using neuroscience and behavioral science and my own personal experience and interviews with some extremely brilliant people. There are lots of books out there that are about talking about race. Extremely valuable. I've read many of them. I recommend them. The point of those books, though, on the whole, is to give you the context of race or the history of race, why you don't touch a Black person's hair, why it's racist to refer to an Asian American person as a model minority. This book is about how to get through the conversation step by step. And it starts with why we must have the conversation and why we have to stop avoiding it. Then it moves on to why this is so difficult for us. Not just emotionally, but neurologically speaking. What is going on inside of our brains that makes this so hard to talk about in an honest way and so hard to tell the truth? Because we don't tell the truth about race. We don't. There's one experiment in which they gave people this whole list of behaviors, all these different things, and they asked them anonymously to check off all the things they've done. There were things like dressing as an Indian for Halloween, or laughing at a racist joke that someone else has told, all the way up to using the N-word or worse. A whole list. They all marked down which things they had done and which things they had not done. And then sometimes later they said, we need your help. We want you to evaluate other people's quizzes. So they brought everybody back. They had them take a look at someone else's list of things that they'd done. And then they said, make a comparison. Is this racist, what they're talking about? In comparison with this person, are you more or less racist? And pretty much all of them said, I am significantly less racist than this person. But of course, they were looking at their own list. So you see, we don't tell the truth, even to ourselves. We don't tell the truth about our own biases, the stereotypes we hold inside our heads, the assumptions we make of others, our fears. This is not just true of racism, it's true of ageism and sexism. It is crucial that we begin by telling the truth to ourselves. And I know it's hard and uncomfortable. It's even harder to break through those unconscious biases, the stereotypes and racism and all of that lives in your wiring. And of course it lives in your wiring because you have been watching TV for your whole life that has implanted this stuff in your subconscious, the books that you've read, what you've heard from your grandparents, your teachers, your neighbors, all of that is somewhere in your gray matter. And it is hard to dig out. That's why we need each other. This is the way our human species works. We act as each other's checks and balances. We're not objective about whether what we just said was racist or not. We need our friends to say, whoa, hey, wait a second. I'm not sure if you meant the way it sounded. We need people to sometimes say, I know you're the kind of person who wants to be inclusive and anti-racist, and what you just said doesn't seem appropriate to me. I tried to be very honest in the book about mistakes that I've made, and obviously there was no way I was going to be able to include every single mistake I've made. They are legion. But I listed a few things that I have done wrong. I've used the word gypsy in the past. I've used the word Eskimo, which is also inappropriate. At one point in a conversation at a conference, I used the phrase paddy wagon. And it was an Irish person who explained to me how heavily weighted that phrase is with anti-Irish bias. These are mistakes that I have made, but they're cases in which I made this mistake and someone else was generous enough to interrupt me and correct me. And I was able to accept that correction without thinking it somehow made me catastrophically racist, that this person was calling me a horrible person. I had to recognize that what they were saying to me was, what you just said was inappropriate and wrong and might hurt someone. Not, you're the worst person on the planet. At some point in my life, I realized that I could not possibly know everything that there is to know about race and culture. And that means I need other people to step in and help me. Of course, you can't know everything there is to know about race. You may be a race scholar and you're not going to know everything there is about race. You will still step into some other culture as you're traveling or you meet someone new and realize there's something you don't know. There's this great moment in the movie Dune, and there's no spoilers here. This is just a tiny little moment when one of the people on the planet, the leader of the people comes in, of the Fremen comes in to meet the new, I guess, leader. And the leader talks to him. He's trying to convince him to ally with them. And the leader of the Fremen says, spits on the ground. And his guards grab their swords because they're ready to, kill this guy for his insolence and his insult to their leader, only to be stopped by someone who knows the Fremen culture and says, thank you so much for this gesture of respect, that on this planet where there's no water, spitting on the ground is actually a gift of moisture and a sign of respect. And I remember seeing that and saying, what a great reminder not to make assumptions about the things that people do. but to learn to ask questions first, to try to give people the benefit of the doubt. So if you say something wrong and someone else corrects you and you're able to prevent that response of defensiveness in your brain, and you can say to them, I apologize. I didn't realize that what I said was offensive. Do you have time to explain why? I can go and research this for myself if you'd rather not. This is extremely important because while it's okay to ask, do you mind? Could you? Do you have time to explain to me why? That's not always going to be the case. It might be the case that they don't want to. It might be the case that they are exhausted of these kind of conversations. It might be the case that they don't think it's appropriate for someone to use them as their Google search. This is especially true of people of color. And this is understandable. We know that when a person of color raises an objection about either a behavior or a comment that's been made, statistically speaking, they are much more likely to be punished for making that objection. They're not respected, they're not persuasive, and they're much more likely to be seen as troublemakers and complainers. So it's okay if they don't feel like explaining this to you. Having these kind of conversations has been, in some cases, damaging for people of color. One of the things that I talk about in the book is the idea of consent and the ethics of conversation, what we owe to people in conversation. What are the boundaries? I'm not trying to give you answers here, although I give you a few guidelines. I'm trying to encourage you to think about these things. And of course, there's the underlying questions. Why should we care if someone else is offended? This comes up all the time with comedians. Can't you take a joke? What if we think that other person is being overly sensitive? But I would say the same thing to you that I would say to any comedian. A, try harder. If what you're saying is hurtful to other people, you're not trying hard enough. But also, you can't tell other people how to feel or whether they should be hurt or not. You can't tell them what to be upset about. That's like stepping on somebody's toe and saying, stop crying, that didn't hurt that badly. You have no idea how that feels. And in terms of our biology and our neurology, we know that when you are not experiencing a negative thing, a human being becomes incredibly inaccurate about how uncomfortable that thing is. I'll give you an example. One of the experiments that tested this had two groups of people. And first they showed them pictures of puppies. Lovely, everyone enjoyed it. Then they showed everybody pictures of maggots. And not surprisingly, everyone hated that. But the difference came when they showed this group a picture of puppies and this one a picture of maggots. The people who saw puppies immediately thought, it's not that bad to have to look at a video or photo of maggots. It's not that upsetting. Whereas the people who were actually looking at it thought, this is actually very upsetting. Please stop showing me this picture. As soon as we're comfortable, we stop being accurate at estimating other people's reactions to things, how much they'll be hurt, how uncomfortable they are. So if you are in a place of comfort, it is not your place to tell someone else how to feel. One of the things that prevents us from having a culture of correction and openness is this defensiveness that we feel when we think someone has attacked us because we've said something racist. We live in a verbal society, and what that means is that it is very unlikely someone's going to walk up and punch you in the face. It means that most of the attacks you endure are going to come in the form of verbal criticism. And for human beings throughout our entire history on this planet of 300,000 years and change, our social standing has meant the difference between life and death, quite literally. Social standing to a human being is no laughing matter. It never has been. And that's one of the reasons some jokes aren't acceptable. Who is welcome in the community? Who is ostracized? That, again, is a thin line between survival and death. for our species. And so when someone criticizes you, maybe tells you that what you've said is insensitive, your brain and your body react much the same way they would if you were punched in the face. We respond as though that criticism was a physical attack. Now, you may feel the criticism is totally unfair. After all, you see injustice, the injustice racism has caused. You are angered by racial inequities. You're outraged that some have lost their lives to racism. That is how you see yourself. What you don't see are your unconscious biases. They are unconscious. And when they leak out, because they always leak out, and someone points them out, you experience cognitive dissonance. There's this vast gap between this action, someone saying, you said paddy wagon, that's insensitive, and the idea I have about myself that I am a open-minded, fair, unprejudiced person. That's how I see myself. And it doesn't match with this. Cognitive dissonance is a very painful state of mind. And you can relieve that pain in a few ways. You can say, well, clearly there's some unconscious biases living in my subconscious. I'm going to work hard to get rid of them and become more aware of them. And oh, by the way, at the same time, I'm going to be compassionate to myself while I'm working on this because it's hard. You can go that way. Or you can just say, that wasn't racist. You can't take a joke. Therefore, that again allows me to preserve this image of myself. What I tried to write about in this book is how to go through this process of accepting that everyone on the planet is biased in some way. And so we at least have a little bit of common ground on which to start the conversation. And I especially want white people to read the book. I want everyone to, it's going to be helpful, but white people, this is your work. And I don't want that to feel like a burden. I actually think this is an incredible opportunity. This generation has the chance to change the course of history. And decades of research shows that white people, especially white men, are the most persuasive when it comes to these issues. They are the least likely to suffer penalties for it. So white people, and especially white men, you can do this. You actually have the power to do this. And I really hope that's an exciting prospect. Most of us know that race is fictional. It's not biologically real, it is made up. But race is real because racism is real. And racism is everywhere. It is all around us. And that's why we have to point it out all the time. Unconscious bias needs to become conscious. Implicit bias needs to become explicit. And we do that not by shying away or running away from the conversation or avoiding it because we just want to keep the peace at our holiday dinner. We need each other. We rely upon one another. And obviously, we need to be compassionate to one another. And that compassion starts with being compassionate to ourselves. And one last thing, that James Baldwin quote that I wanted to start this speech with: not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. He said that in 1962. Thanks.
There's my clap button or my cheers or how do I celebrate you? Thank you, Celeste. I'm really excited to be able to be here with you today and to have this conversation. I think, you know, we're all talking about it, we're all thinking about it, and I love the new perspective that you're kind of bringing into and layering onto it. So I've got a ton of questions that have been sent in advance, and we sort of picked a few of them that we want to talk about. And so I think we should just sort of jump in and see how far we can get.
Great.
So I'll start with the topics of race, sexuality, and religion often lead to monolithic conversations where intersectionality is often ignored or an afterthought. In what ways do you suggest speaking to intersectional identities without forcing one identity to overshadow another?
So there's a couple things. The first thing is that anytime you're having a conversation about race, and I'm using the word conversation very explicitly here, we're not talking about policy debates. That's a completely separate set. We're not talking about social media, which is not a conversation. You need to keep it as personal as possible. You don't need to talk about Black people. You don't need to talk about Asian American people. You need to talk about yourself and your own experience with race and identity. And that's always going to be intersectional. I can't talk about my own racial identity without talking about the fact that I'm Black and Jewish and tiny portion Native American, and that I am an intersection in and of myself. As long as you keep it personal, you're not going to get in trouble speaking for others or leaving people out. How do you leave yourself out? Right? This is how you prevent yourself from saying things like the Blacks. That you don't need to be talking about big, important systemic issues in these conversations. You need to be talking about yourself and talking about this other person and having a mutual exchange. The other thing I might mention is I would leave all the terminology out of it. Intersectionality is great and super important for race scholarship. A lot of the terms that we use are they're not plain language. And over the course of a conversation, it's better to use the plain language. Microaggression is specific. I'm super grateful for all the scholarship that has gone into creating these terms that are quite specific to race studies. But in the course of a conversation, a microaggression is the same thing as something rude that somebody did. And if they only do that rude thing to Asian Americans, then it's also racist, right? We need to use plain language. And the reason I say we have to use plain language is because plain language is inclusive. Okay. When we use terminology that has to be explained or is confusing, the person who doesn't understand it either has to go through this period of time of pretending they know what you're talking about, or they feel they can feel condescended to, or they can just feel you are trying to exclude them. So plain language.
I like that. I like that. All right, next question. There's a current movement in this country to label everything in our schools that touches on diversity and inclusion as critical race theory. I hear you sighing, you knew where I was going. What can I say to help these people see that talking about race isn't further dividing us?
Okay, so first, critical race theory, any law that bans critical race theory is completely and totally moot because no one is teaching critical race theory in grade school. Done. If what you're trying to do is ban the teaching of our racial history in schools, well, then I have some serious questions for you. So I have to get very specific with people when they talk about banning critical race theory. I start asking them, what exactly do they mean? I mean, the first thing I say is, that's fine. I agree with you. We should never be teaching critical race theory in grade school because it's super advanced. Over 99% of the country, I think, has never taken a class in CRT. Agreed. Common ground. So what is it that you're objecting to? What has your child come home and told you about that you thought was inappropriate for their age group? That's how I begin to talk, is get very, very specific. In the research that we've done on scientists have done on confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is when you believe something that's untrue. Someone comes in and proves to you, shows you the evidence that it's untrue, and it makes you believe it harder. That's confirmation bias. We are the only species on the planet that suffers from it. So in our research on how to break through confirmation bias, the one thing we have found is that when you force someone to explain and articulate in specific ways all of not just their belief itself, but all the implications of that belief, that's one of the only things that has been shown to put a crack in confirmation bias. So just ask them exactly what they mean. They don't mean critical race theory, I guarantee you. I guarantee you. So try to get at what they mean.
I like that. And it helps to further the dialogue, right? We can talk more about it. We can dig in further because you're inviting them to speak instead of sort of shutting them down. I like that. All right. Here's another one in that area around shutting people down. So here's a question. How can I talk to my white male counterparts, friends, and family members that feel threatened and angry about the woke movement? And this one is particularly interesting to me because I'm having conversations at work with white male counterparts who feel uncomfortable around the diversity work that's being done in hiring and feel like they are now being excluded from opportunities because the space is being opened up, for diverse, employees. So how do we talk to our white male counterparts, and how do we address it?
So the first thing you say is, oh, I'm sorry, which promotion did you lose because a Black person took it?
Mm.
People talk in these generalities, and they need to talk about themselves. Don't talk about Black people taking your opportunities. Which opportunity did you lose? And where is the African American that took it? Right? Again, we have to get hyper personal and very, very specific. And frankly, when someone uses a word like woke culture, I say, I am not familiar with that term. What does it mean? What do you mean by woke culture specifically? Which part of culture is woke? This is the same thing with cancel culture. I just had this conversation yesterday when someone was complaining about cancel culture. And I said, I want you to give me a specific example of someone who said the wrong thing for a minor comment that they made or a remark that they made, they've been canceled. And he immediately said Dave Chappelle. And I said, well, it doesn't really count. All of his other specials are staying on Netflix. He's worth $400 or $500 million. He's still selling out shows. So he hasn't been canceled. So can you give me an example of someone who's been canceled? And he eventually, he sat and thought, and he said, I can't think of anybody except for people who actually did horrible things. And I was like, so, and it's the same thing here. You can give people all the statistics in the world. I was giving a speech for a major scientific corporation, and one of the complaints an employee had for their CEO was, do we have to continue with this diversity program? I'd really rather just hire qualified people. I could absolutely cite all the statistics showing that you're not actually hiring the most qualified people, that, every single time we do the resume challenge or even the interview challenge where we remove gender and race from it, or manipulate the gender or the race, right, by changing the name, the white male gets the job every time, with an identical resume, with an identical test, everything identical. So no, you're not hiring the most qualified people, but statistics just aren't that persuasive to people. They just aren't. What's persuasive is the storytelling that has been so important to our culture and our species for so long. So you have to force them to be specific with you. If somebody says that to me, I say, which person did you hire who's unqualified? Because that's a problem. That means the HR is failing you. Yeah.
I like that. And then pause.
Exactly. Just be done.
Yeah. All right. So would love to hear your thoughts on how to hit the balance of correcting folks who mean well, but make mistakes with language, with actions, and with intent. And we talked about this the other day. How do we continue to encourage their journey without completely alienating them, right? And so encouraging people to, to participate in that conversation, correcting the mistakes, but how do we keep them engaged?
Okay, so there's a couple things here. And the first thing I want to teach you originally came as a marketing strategy. It's the 60-20-20. Now, Dolly Chugh, a Harvard-educated, brilliant woman, was the first person to apply it to prejudice. But I use it in my book, and it is this. We're talking in broad strokes. You can separate any group of people into 60, 20, and 20, meaning that 20% are on board with the change. Whatever it is, they are on board, that you don't have to convince them, they're ready to work in favor of it. 20% will not change. Nothing you say, nothing you do, they are stuck. They're often called the stuck 20, is going to change their mind, and it's a waste of breath to try to do so. And so therefore you change policies to make it disincentivized for them to express their stuck stubbornness, right? But the important group is the one in the middle. That's 60% that could go either way. So to a certain extent, when you are speaking to someone else, you kind of have to be aware of who it is, right? Because if you're speaking to someone in that bottom 20%, your audience is not them. They're not going to change. It's the 60, it's the movable middle. That's who your audience is. And so you are speaking in a way that's trying to tell them, I'm pointing out what this person said is inappropriate. It is absolutely worthwhile for me to do so, even if they won't change their mind, because we have an audience. And when you do that, when you are interrupting microaggressions, when you're interrupting these comments, every single minor comment counts. I could give you all the studies, but as I've just said, it will not convince you. But let me tell you that even those tiny little jokes, those little minor comments, they actually are as damaging when we study it as even the overt prejudice and bias. So all of them have to be interrupted. And you can use the STAR system, STAR, which is stop, tell, assist, restore. Stop. You interrupt them immediately. Try to prevent them from even finishing the sentence. Of course, you're giving the message that those things cannot be expressed in public. Stop, tell, you're going to say, I am upset by what you're saying. I disagree. I have another different perspective. You don't say, don't curse in front of the ladies. You don't say, you're going to hurt the feelings of all the Asian American people at our company. You say, that hurts me. I'm upset by what you just said. I have a different perspective. Now, the third one is assist. You're assisting them by telling them why it has upset you. You're not, you understand that at no point here have I said, you're a racist mofo. That was awful. You're saying, stop saying that. I disagree with you. Here's why. And then you're going to, very important step, which is restore. You're going to restore their humanity. And you're going to say, I know you're the kind of person who really wants to create an inclusive environment. The person I know is, not exemplified by what you just said. And I just wanted to point out that that doesn't match the person that I know. And you restore their humanity.
I like that. I'm gonna have to come back and listen to the recording so I can write that down. All right, so homework time. When we finish reading Speaking of Race, everyone, when we finish reading it, are there other books or authors that you recommend that we read? And I know there's a lot of them out there. And so are there maybe a top one or two for you, books or authors that you would recommend people consider?
Yeah, I put, let me go find out where they actually placed it and called it, because I created a reading and homework list. So I have I think 3 or 4 pages, maybe even 5. It's called a reading list, but it also includes like films that you can watch. There's quizzes that you should take. There's things like, I separated them out in like the must reads, right? The books that are classics for a reason, like Native Son by Richard Wright, or Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Dr. Tatum, who by the way, I interview in the book, The Souls of Black Folks, right? There's other things that, should be able to satisfy anyone's curiosity. There's books that are really, really focused on our psychology, why we are biased. And there's books on things like history, current events. I've separated them all out. I mean, if you're gonna it's hard for me to say if you're going to start with one, start here, because it depends on what's your question.
Yeah.
Right. Like if you want to, even if I were just to say, well, read an Ibram Kendi book, which book you read depends on what your question is. If you're trying to understand how we got here, I'd start with Stamped from the Beginning. Like that's a history of how we got here and why we're still in the middle of race, or Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, which does much the same thing. But you have to start with what do I want to know? And then sometimes it's not nonfiction at all that is the most powerful for us. Sometimes what you need is a novel or fiction, or The Fire This Time from Jesmyn Ward. And Jesmyn Ward is a freaking amazingly gorgeous author, or Audre Lorde, or, I mean, it really depends. And then I also recommend a number of podcasts, if that's how you want it. I mean, frankly, I was just trying to say in those pages that whatever your spice, I've got the flavor for you. Right? Whatever it is, you can do this. You can dig a little deeper.
Okay. So we don't need to dig into specific names here. We can go in and figure out what we want, and you've got the recipe for it. I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. All right. So next question. how do you call out a colleague professionally in a public situation? So for example, the person suggested using guys over folks in a presentation. I know for a fact there are multiple non-binary folks in this group. Is it better to call it out privately or publicly in a let's be sure we use inclusive language kind of a way? What do you suggest?
So calling something out publicly is always a high stakes thing. Like I wouldn't do that for someone using guys instead of folks. That's usually a slip of the tongue. Listen, I make that slip of the tongue all the time. I mean, I'm 50 years old. I grew up using guys. I'm not excusing myself. It's something I'm working on, but it comes out sometimes. I mean, I grew up watching Electric Company with Morgan Freeman and Rita Moreno, and she starts that whole thing going, hey, you guys, right? Like this has been drilled into my brain, and it's going to take me a little bit of work. But frankly, that means that I don't mind the text or the short email going, hey, you used just a note or a little tap on the shoulder. You used the guy's word again, just bring it up. Because that actually helps me learn not to, I mean, that's helping me. But bringing it up in a public public arena, as I was saying before, that's the same for our society as a physical attack. That's how my body and brain will react, because social standing is so important. And so those public call outs need to be reserved for the cases in which your audience is important. In other words, if somebody says something against the trans community, and it's in public, I need to publicly say that's not okay, right? That's important, not just so that they know, but if there happens to be a trans person in the vicinity, they can feel safe. Right? We need them to know that I know this isn't okay and it's going to be called out. But every other time, I would think, like if somebody, again, to use that example, guys versus folk, don't think of it as calling out, think of it as calling in.
I like that. So this next question spoke to me because it sort of makes me think about my work environment. I work in a space where I'm sort of helping people to find new opportunities. I'm helping people with the hiring process. And I recently had a conversation with a young man who said, well, I don't want to rock the boat. I just, want to, it's okay, right? And he's in sort of a challenging situation with a manager. And so the question here is, how do you start to become more comfortable with your race when you were raised to blend in and don't make a scene, right? So I'll change race to voice, right? To become more comfortable with your voice and to stand up when you've always been told, keep your head down, work hard, you'll be recognized for your hard work, don't make a scene, don't bring attention to yourself. But in the workforce, raises, promotions, and opportunities are given to people who put their hands up and who make a scene and who bring attention to themselves. How do you balance that?
So first of all, whether something becomes a scene is entirely dependent on the reaction in most cases, right? If you say, hey, I'm the only, it feels uncomfortable that I'm the only female in the room and I'm always the one making coffee. Can we share this, right? How someone reacts to it, that determines whether it's a scene or not. But frankly, these fears are actually totally justified, because we have tons of evidence that even women judge other women harshly when they act outside of gender expectations. In fact, they have discovered that for every culture we've studied, men are much more likely to engage in hostile sexism. But guess which gender is more likely to engage in benevolent sexism, friendly sexism? It's women. We are more likely to punish a woman when we think she's being unfeminine.
Yeah. So
it is absolutely understandable that you would be afraid of rocking the boat if that's against your gender identity expectations or your racial expectations. However, a couple things. We also know that when somebody does not speak up, about a microaggression or a bias statement or whatever it is, if they keep their mouth shut, that ends up having a really corrosive effect on your well-being that can last for decades. So when you're weighing this, should I do this, should I not, you need to take this into account, that suppressing that is actually super bad for you. And then you have to ask yourself, if I'm in this work environment in which I have to cover my authentic self in order to fit in, is this the right work environment for me?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All right, next question. I had one, but I'm going to give this one first. So do you have a recommendation? Is there a list out there for awareness for language and phrases that we shouldn't use, right? Like you mentioned, you grew up using guys, right? I grew up watching Electric Company as well. There's language that we've grown up using, that we've heard our whole lives, we've used our whole lives. And then as we grow and we're exposed to more people, we become aware that language can be hurtful. Is there some place that we can find a list? Do you have a list that can kind of help people to start thinking about language that's commonly used that might be hurtful?
This is where we rely on our race scholars.
Yeah.
Many of them have made these lists. None of them are complete, right? Because it changes all the time. Mm-hmm. For example, somebody asked me if it's racist to use the phrase master bedroom. This is a friend of mine who's a realtor. I had to look that up. It, in fact, is not in any way, shape, or form connected to what you think it's connected to. But I had to look it up, mm-hmm. Right? So this is when I say that we rely on one another. You have to be the kind of person that doesn't get upset when people point this stuff out. You have to be the kind of person that doesn't get angry, because that's going to give other people the psychological safety to speak up, right? I like to think that because people know I'm not going to freak out and say, I wasn't racist, right? When I say something wrong, as I have again and again and again, that's why people feel comfortable saying it to me. I gave a speech for the Broadway League, and the Broadway League is a lot of very powerful people who they're the ones who run all the theaters around the country that get Broadway shows, right? Kennedy Center, etc. And as you can imagine, there was only a couple Black women in the audience. And at one point in my speech, I used a phrase, that news video of the woman who says, ain't nobody got time for that. And they made like a remix. And I used a picture of that, which was like a demonstration of me saying, we don't have time for whatever this is. And the two Black women came up and said, this made us uncomfortable. You had a bunch of pictures of like Bill Nye in a bow tie and Einstein in his sweater. And then the only picture you had of a Black person was her. And I was like, you know what? That's fair. That's absolutely fair. And this is the same thing I would say with lists. You can find them. Yeah. Yes. All you have to do is go to Google and search words and phrases you never knew were racist. And you will find lots of lists. Yeah. But the better thing to do is be the kind of person who's open to correction.
We can grow. All right. You said earlier, white people, this is your work. And I love that, right? I think we talk about the fact that people of color become responsible for this work, and we need allies to not just support, but really to kind of step forward. How do we make space for white people to do this work while still recognizing that their experience doesn't allow them to be an authority in the space?
Nobody's an authority in this space. There is no person who is an overall authority here. Everybody has space to learn. You know what you're an authority in? You're an authority in what it's like to be you, of your skin color, as a Black woman in the United States. And I'm an authority on what it's like to be a Black, Jewish, Buddhist, single mom in the United States, right? And even that, I'm not even, my son's 23. So there's stuff I don't even know right now. So stop thinking in terms of experts and authorities and think in terms of curiosity about one another. The other thing I would say is that we have to let white people step in. However, if you are a white person, let's say that somebody says something derogatory to Black women at a meeting. Super common, happens all the time, right? Refers to a Black colleague as an angry woman or something. Now, if you are a white person in that meeting and you realize that that's a racist thing to say, you can actually turn to your Black female colleague and say, is it okay if I take this? You can do that. You usually only have to do it once, because if you do it right, which means taking it on yourself, that upsets me that you just said that. That's inappropriate. That makes me feel uncomfortable, rather than saying, let me speak for my Black colleague, Denise, and say, you have probably just upset her. No, you take it on yourself. But once you do that and you do it right by taking ownership, you probably don't have to ask for permission again. The reason why Denise doesn't want you speaking for her is because you've, in the past, so often other people are speaking for her and not themselves. This is one of the reasons why we often don't want white people to stand up. We don't want you talking for us. That privileged position in which you get the attention because you're white, and then you start saying how we feel and what upsets us. You know, one of the great race educators currently active is Tim Wise, who, one of the things that makes him so great is he never speaks for anybody else. He's a white dude and he speaks for white people. He speaks to white people, he speaks for white people, and he's actually extremely effective at understanding his own culture. So, you know, in terms of making space, if somebody says the wrong thing, let them know about the comment using some version of the star system, so that at some point you are restoring their humanity. Acknowledge that they tried, and don't beat them with a hammer for the mistake that they made over the course of trying.
So I want to expand it a little bit. And so thinking about, we'll see a commercial where a sort of well-intentioned, group of people decide that they want to do something that's a little bit more liberal, that's a little bit more, race conscious, whatever it is. And then it somehow makes it all the way through the entire production process and makes it to the air, and you see it and you think, there was definitely no person of color involved in this process from the beginning all the way to the end of it.
Like
right?
Kylie Jenner in the Pepsi can.
That's exactly what's in my mind right now. I sent you that image, right? And so, when you say white people, this is your work, right? Like, I think I want to kind of dig in a little bit further here, where, we want to make sure that we don't end up with those types of scenarios, right? Where it's like, okay, this is my work. I'm going to step in. I'm going to do great things, without in any way consulting, and you end up with something that's well-intentioned, but really tone deaf, right? So,
okay, we're talking about two different things.
Okay.
You're talking about a work product.
Yeah.
And the fact that there's a company in which there's zero people of color with any power or say all the way along the chain,
yes,
that's a systemic problem.
Yes.
I'm talking about these conversations that we have. And the reason I say that is because so often I hear someone say, well, my uncle won't stop saying racist crap, so I've stopped going to Thanksgiving, or I just ignore him, or I don't talk about it. And I get it. Believe me, I get it. But at the same time, my pushback on that is the person who has the most power to convince your racist Uncle Fred to stop saying that stuff, to stop referring to people of color as colored people or Negroes, is somebody that he cares about and who looks like him, resembles him. And guess who that is? That's you. So you can eschew that responsibility. You can say it's not on me if he acts like a jerk, and you're right. But you're also sending racist Uncle Fred out into the world to commit these microaggressions and harm the feelings and damage people of color every day. That's what you're doing. And you're putting up no protest at all. Whereas if you just spend instead of ignoring it, just talk to him until you reach the point where you can't tolerate it. Or he says something where you're like, I'm not going to listen to you say that stuff anymore. I'm leaving.
Yeah.
And if you do that again and again and again, if you keep at it, it will either change him or he's one of the stuck 20. But you should never let him say that stuff without protest. That's your work, white people. And it is your work because nobody believes us when we say it. Nobody believes women when they say that was sexist, and nobody believes people of color. Even other people of color are likely to view a Black person or a Latinx person as a complainer and troublemaker when they bring up these issues, as opposed to a white person. This is how deeply entrenched these biases are in our system. They're in us.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, so Celeste, we're down to our last 5 minutes. I can toss one more question your way, or I can pause and say, is there anything else that you know, we had a bunch of questions, we went through some things. Is there anything else that you want to make sure that you say before we finish today?
We can get to the other question. The only thing I would say is that no amount of me talking on this webinar, it makes up for the book. It's available for pre-order now. I mean, I really did try very hard to make it practical. Yeah. Right? Like this is news you can use. So that's all I would say. But yeah, we can do another question.
All right. So it's another work question. That's kind of my space, right? Yeah. So if you could implement 1 or 2 changes today in the DEI language that's used in business culture, what do you consider the most essential changes to creating an environment of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace?
So I want to borrow from Cindy Gallup, who says that if we were doing things right, there would be no need anywhere for a diversity department in any company anywhere. Yeah. Like you don't need a diversity company if that's your company's way of doing business. So the fact that you have to have a DEI committee or division or executive shows something's going wrong. Yeah. The other main thing I would say is that we know that standard diversity training doesn't work. We know it now. We knew it 5 years ago. We knew it 10 years ago. So stop with the videos and the emotional discussions of what your colleagues of color have been through. That's re-traumatizing for them. Even if they want to express it, it is re-traumatizing. And it actually, we know it doesn't affect any change. So essentially you're asking your colleagues of color to bleed out for you to no end, for no purpose, again and again and again. And we know that those videos that people show, those little training courses with the quizzes, the multiple choice, they do nothing. And in many cases, it actually increases the likelihood that someone will behave in a discriminatory way. And I'll explain to you partially why. For example, when they took a whole groups of white people and they had basically an exercise for them to do. And it changed depending on the experiment in the group of scientists, but they were exercises like who to hire for a police officer position, white candidate, black candidate. Or in another case, they gave them a bunch of civic money, city money, and they had to decide which departments to put them through, right? And some of the departments, it clearly, very explicitly benefited white people. Some of them, it benefited communities of color. For the groups where they allowed those people, you know, every time you participate in a study, they'll give you like a little, you have to fill out a quiz, like about yourself, here's who I am. If for those people who in that quiz, there was a question of, did you vote for Barack Obama? If the white people were allowed to endorse Barack Obama before they made these decisions, they were significantly more likely to behave in a way that benefited white people. They gave the job to the white police officer. They gave the money to the white departments again and again and again. And all they've done is say, yep, I voted for Barack Obama. And the reason for this is that when you give somebody an opportunity to say, I took diversity training, I can't possibly be racist, then they stop watching themselves. Obviously, their decision is okay and anti-racist because they got their certificate. They completed their annual diversity training. They are not racist. When you approached diversity, which again, I find problematic, as though it's something you can earn a certificate or a badge of completion for, people stop forgetting that it has nothing to do with whether you answered a question right or wrong. It's how you speak to the people around you. It's how you behave to the people around you. Racism is not a knowledge problem. We have known it's wrong for a very long time.
Yeah.
It is a behavior problem. And behavior, we know how to fix. You stop incentivizing bias, and you start and punish it instead, and you start rewarding anti-racism and actual inclusion. That makes that change.
I like it. All right, I'm taking it back. Celeste, thank you so much. Thank you. It's been an absolute joy to talk with you and to get to know you over the course of the last few sessions and conversations we've had. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. Again, Celeste's book, Speaking of Race, will be in stores on November 2nd, and it's available for pre-sale now at the Conference for Women online bookstore. So let's blow it up. Let's make that site shut down from so many purchases. Thank you to our session sponsors, the Massachusetts Conference for Women, the Boston Globe, and State Street. You will all receive an email shortly with a link to today's session. Again, we encourage you to share that link and all of the great nuggets that we got from Celeste today. Share it with your friends, share it with your racist uncle. Let's get them all on board for the conversation. Be on the lookout for the next session in this series coming in January. Thank you very much and have a lovely afternoon. Thanks, everyone.